One of the advantages of being a guitar player today is that we have access to some of the best technology, not only to create a lot of the classic sounds that were recorded in guitar history and being able to kind of encapsulate those into smaller and more convenient packages, but also the ability to record from home in a way that would ordinarily have taken several different amps, multiple different cabinets, and sometimes even a stereo power amp. And what I'm going to talk about today is a product that I really feel made my home recording much bigger, much wider, and overall just a incredibly pleasant and gratifying experience. And I was reminded of this when I went to record somewhere outside my house and I wasn't able to bring the normal products that I would use. And I noticed that the guitar tone that I was getting was much smaller, much thinner, and not at the level that I had become used to throughout the pandemic when I really started to develop my home recording studio and doing a lot of recordings myself. Now that product is none other than the Stereo Cab Zeus. And although there are many different applications for the Cab Zeus, I'm going to show you the way that I'm using this in order to get the best of not only my tube amplifiers, but being able to send an image of those tube amplifiers to the Cab Zeus to give me a wider, fatter, and more healthy sounding guitar than I could ever have imagined, and frankly, that I could get in any other way. And I've been able to prove that to myself by doing some recordings without this and then reintroducing it and really just missing the heck out of it. And this has become a quintessential piece of my guitar sound. When I don't have it, I miss it, and I can definitely tell the difference in terms of how thick, how fat, and how much body my guitar tone has. And when it's not in the signal path, my overall tone suffers as a consequence. But before we continue with the Stereo Cab Zeus and why it's so great, I want to remind people that only about 20% of you watching at any given week are actually subscribers. And many of you do believe that you're subscribed to the channel, but actually are not. So I ask you to validate and verify that you are actually subscribed if you want to continue to get updates with new videos every single week. And if you're not subscribed, this is a great time to subscribe. I welcome you to do that so that you can support us, and it will send you updates every single week as we come out with new content. Now back to the Cab Zeus. So what makes this such a great piece of gear that I really think is indispensable for me and has really been proven to me as I've continued to record with and without it, depending on what my location is it does a few things. The first thing that it does in my context is that it allows me to run a wet, dry, wet rig with only one amplifier and only one speaker cabinet. Ordinarily, if you run a wet, dry, wet rig, it requires at least one amplifier for the dry, a preamp and a power amp, a line out box, and then that would feed your wet effects and then a stereo power amp of some kind, and then additional speaker cabinets for both the left and right. Now what the Cab Zeus does is it eliminates the need for the stereo power amp, and it eliminates the need for the two extra cabinets for the wet left and wet right. And although the Cab Zeus is not claiming to do a power amp simulation, when you use a line out box from your amplifier, you are getting the power amp and the preamp section of your actual dry amplifier. It's just omitting the speaker from the signal path. And so you're using that Cab Zeus to be the representative speaker that's creating that wider sound. So not only do you get that image of your original amp in the middle, but you get that same amp then fed to your wet processing effects, so delay and reverb and some modulation effects, then fed into a simulated speaker and microphone simulation by way of the Stereo Cab Zeus. Now inside of their software, they have something called Cabs Lab where you can decide what type of speaker emulation that you want based on some classic types of speakers, as well as different types of microphones that you can pair with the speaker cabinet in order to get a sound that's best for you. typically to emulate the classic wet, dry, wet settings. A lot of those speaker cabinets back then mostly used vintage 30s or EVM 12Ls. There isn't an option for an EVM 12L on the Cabs Lab. I'm just using a typical 57 and a little bit of a room mic and just trying to mic them somewhere kind of in the middle of the speaker so it doesn't sound too direct, but also doesn't sound too roomy and too boomy. So I'm able to somewhat approximate what I would do if I were actually miking all three different cabinets for wet, dry, and wet in a room, and trying to simulate that through the software. One thing I'll say about it is it absolutely sounds great when you're doing it in this fashion. And I'll link a photo and a file below so that if you decide that you want to get a stereo Cab Zeus or the mono Cab Zeus version, you can upload my exact settings so that you're able to recreate exactly what I'm doing here. But I want to show you how this actually sounds in context. So for my signal path today, I've got my Tom Anderson Super Strat. I've got some DiMarzio pickups in the neck and middle, and then I have a 5150 EVH bridge pickup. I'm going to be running that into my wet, dry, wet pedal board. I'm going to be using the Sir Riot for all of my distortion tones today, and I'm going to be using an RAF Mirage compressor for all of my clean tones today. I'm going to be using the Source Audio Collider for all of the wet, delay, and reverb, and I'm going to be using a little wave from Red 7 for some modulation, as well as an Eventide micro pitch set to a slight pitch shift so that I can get those 80s tones that really sound big and wide. The chorus, the pitch shift, the delay, and reverb are going to be used in all examples, and I'll just be varying up the time of the delay for certain passages. This is all going to be running into the front of a Doctor Special amplifier as the dry amp. I'm going to be using a line out box to feed all of the wet effects from there, and then those are going to feed into the front of the stereo Cab Zeus. So my dry signal is going to be the amp dry alone microphone, that's channel 1, and then the wet left and wet right channels are going to be fed out of the Cab Zeus directly into my interface, into my DAW, which in this case is Logic. So I have 3 total channels. I'm going to have one straight up the middle that's dry, and then I'm going to have one channel of wet hard pan left, and then another channel of wet hard pan right. In the examples today, to really demonstrate what the stereo Cab Zeus is bringing to the table, I'm first going to play a clip that's just dry. Then I'm going to engage the stereo Cab Zeus, and I'm not going to bring in any effects in. You're just going to get to hear the widening aspect of the line out feeding into the Cab Zeus in stereo, but with no processing effects going on, just whatever effects are going to the dry amp. Then I'm going to bring in the processing effects so that you get to hear the ensemble of everything. All the effects going into the dry amp, the line out, feeding all of the wet processing effects, modulation, delay, and reverb, feeding the stereo Cab Zeus, and then going in to the interface and DAW so you get to hear all 3 channels together. So to start out first, let's go with some dirty examples. And again, for this, I'm going to be using the Sir Riot, and I'm going to be using the same combination of modulation, delay, and reverb as I spoke about earlier. Again, Tom Anderson Super Strat, I'm going to be using the bridge position for this, and we're going to get to hear how this sounds. And again, we're going to go in that same order that I talked about in terms of hearing the examples of the clips. I'll also have some indication on the screen as to what you're hearing so that you know what we're adding and what we're building as we go through each section of the clip. Again, going with a dirty example first. Let's check that out. So you heard first just the guitar, the Sir Riot, into the front of the Doctor Special, dry. That's all we heard. Then I added in the Cab Zeus, but with none of the wet effects on. So you got to hear the dry signal basically replicated on the left side hard pan and the right side hard pan, in addition to the dry center. definitely widened out the sound. Then I added in the modulation effects from the Red 7, the micro pitch from Eventide, and the collider for the delay and reverb, and then it just sounded gloriously wide and incredibly fat. Now again, all of the processing was running in parallel. The dry signal is just running again right into channel 1, and then those wet signals are panned hard left and right, again in parallel with the dry amplifier. And it absolutely sounds amazingly big, and you can see as we built on each layer, the guitar sound got fatter, you added in that processing, it even got even more wide, and the modulation helped create this vastness of the guitar tone, so it just really made a guitar that ordinarily would be thought of to be relatively thin. I mean, we have a bolt-on neck, Strat-style guitar, not known to be the fattest guitar sound in the world, and it just made it sound absolutely brilliant and huge, and the mix was just absolutely incredible. But I want to see if this holds up if we go to a clean example. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to disengage the Riot, and I'm going to go into the compressor, the RAF Mirage, and I'm just going to set that to kind of just a regular amount of compression. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to build that into the front of the dry amp, just using one channel and hearing what the compressor does with the guitar and the amplifier alone. Then I'm going to engage the Cab Zeus so that we're hearing that same dry signal line out feeding the wet effects, but those are all bypassed. And then just getting the width of having the hard panned left and right signals in addition to that dry center, basically 3 dry channels at this point. And then I'm going to add in the processing effects on those wet left and wet right sides so that we get that dry center, wet left, wet right after it in parallel with all the modulation, pitch, delay, and reverb all running in parallel with that dry sound, so we can just hear the building of those effects and how much bigger they make the sound as we add each layer. And again, I'll indicate that on the screen so you know it's happening as it's happening, and we're building it out with each example of the clean sound. So let's check that out. So I think it really sounded absolutely great. And again, I can just in playing this, it's very inspiring to hear how much more weight the guitar sound has as the Cab Zeus is introduced. Now, of course, you could do this the old school way using a stereo power amp and using extra cabinets, but that requires at the very least 3 microphones, 1 on each cabinet, a stereo power amp, and it requires that you're bringing quite a bit of gear to any particular gig. The wet dry wet pedal board that I have here is 17 inches by 10 inches. The Cab Zeus is on the pedal board, so it's physically on the same board as everything else. And I'm able to have all these sounds in such a small package that it's kind of unbelievable how much it impacts the sound and how small of a package that it's in relative to what it's doing. I think we clearly heard that as each layer was added, it added more body, more width, more texture. You add in the wet effects on top of that. And of course, it's just a dream of just ambience when you're doing those clean sounds like I was demonstrating. And when you're doing dirtier sounds and maybe have a little shorter delay and a little less mix, you're getting some really fat lead tones, some really nice fat distorted rhythm tones. And I can't think of a better way to enhance the guitar tone in such a small package and something that could really fit on anybody's pedal board and just add that in addition to the dry amp that you're already bringing with so little effort. It's absolutely amazing what it does. Now with the Cab Zeus, in the description, I'm going to leave a settings guide for the exact same way that I set this. I'm also going to leave the file if you have a stereo Cab Zeus so you can upload this and use the exact same settings that I'm using for what you heard today. It's an absolute amazing device, and again, I can't recommend it enough as the easiest possible way to enhance your guitar tone, make it fatter, make it bigger, and clearly you could hear what it was adding with each layer as I introduced this added those wet effects in parallel, just made it sound absolutely huge and so much bigger than it could have been with just the amplifier alone and a microphone. So that was the Stereo Cab Zeus by GFI. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to check out more from GFI, I highly recommend checking out this particular product. They also have a mono version if you don't want to run a stereo kind of system or a wet, dry, wet rig like I was running here with the Stereo Cab Zeus. They do have that other version. They also just make great products in general, but this is one that I can't live without, and I can't see how I can omit this in any rig going forward. It just adds so much body to the overall sound. So definitely do check them out. I'll have a link to their products as well as some of their authorized dealers if you're interested in getting one and adding it to your board. And of course, if you have questions on applications and ways to use it, I'm certainly willing to help you in the comments if you have any questions about it. And of course, GFI has great customer service, and I'm sure they'd be willing to help you on whatever questions that you might have regarding this product. If you want to support us further, again, an easy way to do it is like this video, subscribe to the channel as we mentioned a little earlier. Also, some easy ways to do it are buy our products from an authorized dealer. You can head over to our website. We have a list of all the dealers that sell our products, and there's some really special deals going on right now at Sweetwater, where not only do they have some of the best customer service in the entire business, but also they are selling the Tone Secret, one of my favorite pedals that we ever made, at an extra super special price, $99.99, has some elements of a tube screamer, has some elements of the preamp of a classic black panel Fender mixed together in one pedal. Sounds absolutely great and is a great low to mid gain overdrive. Definitely check that out over on Sweetwater if you're interested in that. Also, another way to support us if you want to have all the beautiful cables like we have on my pedal board, all the interconnections, all of the cables going to and from the guitar and the amplifier, those are all available over on therigdr.com. We sell them in custom lengths, which you can use a drop-down menu to select the exact style of cable, plug, and length that you want, whether it's patch cable, instrument cable, whatever it may be. Definitely do check that out. And another free way to support us is through our podcast. Me, Brian O'Million from O'Million Audio, and Grant Klassen from Goodwood Audio get together every week and do a roundtable discussion on gear, tone, and pedal boards. So if you want to get a little more information along the lines of this video and you want in a longer form version that you could listen to on your commute to or from work, the Chairman of the Boards podcast is a great way to do that and also supports us at the same time. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, aka The Rig Doctor, and that was my love letter to the GFI Cab Zeus, an absolutely amazing piece of gear. I highly recommend that you get one. It is going to change your tone and improve your tone. Great piece of gear. See you next time.